Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the 286 Project. My name is Chris Akers, and in this podcast, we talk about arts, culture, sport, politics, and everything else we can think about. Today, this is going to be arguably my most controversial subject we're going to be talking about because we'll be discussing not just women in sport, but also the whole issue regarding transgenderism in sport as well. And to speak to me about this, I'm joined by Cathy Devine. Cathy, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Chris. Nice to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you here. Before we get into the subject, for those who don't know you, if you can just say a little bit about yourself, who you are, what led you to this point, and why you're so passionate about this particular subject.
Yeah, sure. Well, I'm an independent researcher and consultant at the moment. Previously, I've worked as a senior lecturer at the University of Cumbria in the UK for 23 years. And my specialist subject, my expertise, is in sport policy for girls and women. So obviously, not necessarily obviously, but my research for the last, say, 15 years has been on human rights and sport policy that works for girls and women. And so I've had a look at sports council funding and whether equal amounts of money goes to, the sports that boys and girls want to do or men and women want to do. I've looked at what in European sport policy counts as gender equality, as it was called and still is called then. And of course, I think we probably now know that there's an issue in terms of the two terms, sex and gender. And what else did I do at Cumbria? I taught nutrition because I've got a master's in nutrition. I taught philosophy of sport and I've been a secretary of the British Philosophy of Sport Association. And then prior to that, I worked for a range of different organisations. So I worked for the Women's Institute, National Federation of Women's Institute in London. I was their head of sport. I worked for what was called then the National Coaching Foundation, which is now Coach UK, I think, Sports Coach UK. I have been in a past life a trampoline coach, a gymnastics coach, and a windsurfing instructor. So basically, I've been involved in sport all my life, and I've been primarily focused on, the opportunities in sport for girls and women. So that's where I'm coming from, really.
Okay, it's interesting you talked about sport policy there. And before we talk about transgenderism in sports, because we will talk about later in the interview, but in regards to sports policy policy for girls and women, how, in what ways has it changed from when you started researching that? Has it changed for the better? Are there some parts that still improve? How has it changed specifically?
Well, I guess it's tricky. I mean, if we look at a big kind of historical stretch of time, the founder of the modern Olympics, which was at the beginning of the 20th century, Baron Pierre de Coubertin, thought women shouldn't be involved in elite sport, for example. He thought their job was to crown the victors with garlands. So he thought, I haven't got his quote here, but, feminine Olympiad, according to him, was a non-starter. And there were very few events for women at the beginning of the 1900s. And then if we track through the 20th century, we've had more and more events for women at elite level. But still, there was only boxing was only introduced, I think, into the Olympics in 2012 when it was in London. Marathon for women in 1984, I think it was. And there's various, really interesting kind of historical documentation about women trying to take part in the marathon, the Boston Marathon in particular. And one woman in particular being dragged off the course because an official was so incensed that, a mere woman was participating. So I think we've come a long way, perhaps in the last 100 years, but we've still got an awful long way to go as well. So, yeah, I suppose that's my assessment of it.
Okay, so you say you have a long way to go, although so much has been done. Has anything specifically, because I've interviewed female boxers before, and when I've asked them, okay, how can we improve women's boxing, even though the popularity has increased, certainly over the last 3-4 years, it's just been incredible.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the pay, which, okay, I say is fair enough, but then I also mentioned that a lot of that is based on the market as such.
Yeah.
So in that regard, when it comes to pay, I think obviously two related, pay on the market and how you market a sport as well. So besides pay, what other ways what other improvements could be to women's sport?
Well, I suppose the thing is, you've got to think about, I mean, what you're talking about with boxing there, and a lot of professional sports or elite sports that can garner, say, TV coverage and sponsorship and so on and so forth. I think that's one area of sporting life. And certainly, as I'm sure you know, that female pay is tracks way behind male pay. And it's quite interesting that, because there's quite often an argument, isn't there, that says, oh, well, women's sport's not as popular, therefore there's not as much interest, therefore there's not as much money in it. But I think we've seen with the promotion of women's football, for example, that's not really entirely true, that if you actually promote women's sports and you have that as a mission to do that, you can develop an audience, so develop the spectator base. But I think the other thing to think about is, I suppose my main interest is in mass participation sport, even though I suppose I've published quite a lot about elite sport and the International Olympic Committee. But, what's the participation gap between males and females? And there still is a very kind of stubborn gap between the amount of sport that women do and the amount of sport that men do. So it's like, how can we promote sport in local authorities? How can the sports councils promote sports? And a lot of that doesn't depend on professional sport as such and prize money. So I think, you start in schools, don't you? And you start thinking, well, what gets offered to kids in schools? And I'm not even sure that that's got better rather than worse, because sport in schools is quite often outsourced now, whereas it never used to be. It used to be that teachers, you had, dedicated PE teachers, and those dedicated PE teachers, particularly in secondary school, would cover the whole of the curriculum, which was very broad to make sure kids got competitive team sports, outdoor and adventurous sports, swimming, dance, track and field, and so on. Whereas now it's seen as an area where you can perhaps save money for schools. So if you outsource it to coaches, coaches are generally cheaper to pay than teachers. And so I think the offer that we have in schools for kids is, impoverished really as compared to the ideals of the national curriculum. So, there's a lot to go at really there. And I think there's loads of literature, in the academic sphere, which examines the extent to which the curriculum in schools is a boys' curriculum, because it offers stuff that boys want to do primarily. So that's something, another issue that I've spent a lot of time writing about, that, if we're going to get girls involved in sport, we need to actually ask them what they want to do. Yeah.
Okay, so you discussed like girls' sports, especially in school as well. And I know there's been various talks about the curriculum, be it for going away from sport, be it like more history subjects, or more subjects talked about this and that and the other. And what I say to people is, yes, that's all well and good, it's so well meaning, but you're always going to be restricted by time. So is it the case that, particularly in sport, but women's sport, that you have to focus more on after school, or the after school clubs, or not just at school, but like say leisure centres or certain leagues popping up and so on and so forth?
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head there. I think that's another issue, because I don't know if you've got kids, but my kids have been to schools where the amount of the break that they get at lunchtime is absolutely tiny, and the extracurricular provision is diminished dramatically. And that's because of all sorts of things to do with teachers' terms and conditions, and also to do with schools thinking, oh, it's easier to manage kids if we don't give them an extended lunch break with extracurricular stuff in it. So I think that is a shame for children, because I personally think that physical education is a proper subject that should be taught properly in schools by PE teachers. And even though I'm a coach, I don't think coaches should be brought in to deliver the curriculum. But that is an issue in primary schools, because primary school teachers will quite often tell you they don't feel confident to deliver a PE curriculum. But in secondary schools, certainly, you can have specialist staff. And that, I think, should be backed up by extended curriculum after school. But again, I don't know if you've got kids, but what tended to be offered to my children was football, and more football, and really you need to offer a broad range of activities. So, and then things that are expensive, of course, are difficult for kids to access. So I've done a lot of climbing in my life, and as I say, I've been a windsurfing instructor. Those things are really expensive. You need outdoor education centres. So if we've got, pressure on school budgets, those are the first things to go. Swimming's expensive, so that is, offered as little as possible. It's in the curriculum, so as long as schools fulfil their curriculum requirements, they tend not to offer a lot of swimming to kids as well. So yeah, I think there are a lot of issues in schools.
Okay, so you said about being a windsurfing instructor and certain centres offering certain sports. Yes, okay, there'll be issues with regards to women and sports, but is it as much an issue regarding class as well? And one sport I'm thinking of is regarding rugby union specifically, where it's not the fact that, well, there might be male men like competing in rugby, but it's also like a very small percentage of men who are, like very higher middle, like upper class. Is that a part of an issue as well, class? And that sometimes gets a little bit ignored in this conversation.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, to be fair. I mean, if you look at our Olympic squad, I mean, I know we'll jump back to the elite there, but a disproportionate number of our elite athletes come from a private school background. And one of the reasons for that is that they have excellent sporting provision. So, if you compare and contrast the private school offer in terms of sport to state school offer, there's a massive gap there. So it's unsurprising, if you like, that our elite athletes disproportionately come, particularly in what sometimes are referred to as the sitting down sports. So like sailing and canoeing and horse riding and so on. So I think that is an issue. And it's interesting if we think about money, because I know women's football has taken off dramatically, and certainly as a spectator sport. But in terms of participation, what you find when you look at the preferred choices of girls and boys is that competitive team sports are still very heavily the choice of boys. And that's quite often offered via, say, football clubs or rugby clubs who are doing outreach work. And if you're being cynical, you might say they're wanting to create the next, the next generation of spectators and merchandise purchasers, whereas the things that girls want to do, quite often it's dance, those kinds of things they have to pay for in the private sector. So I think the whole thing about, class certainly, and then the financial differential between how girls access what they want to do and how boys access what they want to do is certainly a big issue. And we need to provide more sport, for my money, in the public sector.
Okay, so just going back to the marketing, because I hear your point about marketing, like women's sports, and this, and I'll take that on board, and I agree with a lot of it. But I'm also a big fan of empowering the individual as well. So in terms of women's sports, how can women empower themselves? And I'm not just talking, I'm talking about the elite, so that their achievements can get noticed. And when I say empower, like market themselves, I don't mean in a 20, 30 years ago stereotypical way where, or you looked at as a woman's figure, because I think that would be wrong, and that's not really the aim of it. So are there ways women themselves can help market themselves to, get their name out there in particular?
It's not really my specialism, to be honest, the whole marketing side of life. And what I think I'd probably say to that is, and it maybe links to what we're going to talk about a bit later, is it's really important that female athletes have a voice. And I think governing bodies have a responsibility to ensure that female athletes have a voice, because quite often, if you look at the Olympics now, you've got half and half, more or less, male female athletes. But when it comes to, for example, the Olympic committees in the different countries in the Olympic movement, and there's just over 200 of them, and there's very few women, or there's disproportionately men on those Olympic committees. So in the decision-making positions in sport, you've got women being underrepresented, men being overrepresented. And I think it's important, therefore, for governing bodies not just to, plough ahead and make decisions regardless of athlete voice, as it's sometimes called, but that female athletes and children in schools, so all the way through the sport performance hierarchy, kids need to be listened to, female athletes need to be listened to. I mean, there's been a lot of initiatives, haven't there? So, female athletes have said, for example, have criticised uniform regulations in some sports. So beach volleyball, for example, is a classic, uniform regulations where the women were very unhappy having to play in very tiny kit. And in tennis, some of the elite tennis players have, mounted campaigns about not playing in white kit due to, menstrual cycle and so on. So I think female athletes, it's great if they, the strength in numbers. So I think individuals speaking out is perhaps quite hard, and individuals doing something about the marketing of their sport is quite hard. But I think if female athletes find their kind of collective power and energy, that maybe takes them some way, towards making an impact in terms of decision making.
Okay. I remember back, I know this is kind of away from sport on the field somewhat. I remember back in the day because I went to sixth form college in the 90s, and it was around late 90s, around about that time, Sky Sports was really coming into its own, especially Sky Sports News, and had a lot of female presenters. And the way they were being presented then, because a lot of them were in magazines like FHM and whatnot, and you'd have the lads in the college having a look at them and so on and so forth. And eventually it took them years for them to be actually recognised as good presenters, as opposed to just very attractive women who just have to be good presenters, if you understand what I mean. So is that still a problem where we almost look at the attractiveness first before we look at the talent of not just female athletes, but just females in sport in general?
Well, I think unfortunately that is still the case, isn't it? That unfortunately female athletes have to do what we call in academia performing femininity. And if you perform femininity, so you look kind of stereotypically attractive as a female athlete, you attract more sponsorship, for example. So I think that still is an issue, and I think it is an issue on TV as well. I mean, more generally, isn't it? On television, it's an issue that women have to look a certain way. If women get older, they're far less likely than older men to get presenting jobs and so on in sport. But I mean, that has changed to a certain extent, hasn't it? We've got Claire Balding, for example. But then again, Sue Barker lost her job, and I don't think, from what we've read about that, that was a mutual decision. So one would have to ask, why as the woman gets older, a sports presenter gets older, do they then lose that presenting job? So, we've probably progressed a bit, but yeah, it annoys me when sport uses attractive young women, stereotypically feminine women, to front sporting programmes, but carry on, if you like, discriminating against the amount of airtime that women's sports get as compared with male sports.
Okay, so how has female coaching changed, in the sense of, has it been increasing the number of women that go into coaching? Has it been steady over the years? Because even with athletes who are well known, I can't think of that many who have gone into coaching coaching. The only one I can think of is possibly, I think it's Mel Marshall, the swimming coach who coaches Adam Peaty, I believe. Yeah. But other than that, and obviously Emma Hayes at Chelsea Football Club, but other than that, I can't think of that many female coaches that have worked their way at the elite level. So have the numbers steadied, or are they increasing?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing, coaching, isn't it? And one of the problems I think with women in leadership positions in sport and in coaching, so kind of coaching, managerial, admin, senior positions in sport, is that if you go back to the 1980s, there were separate male and female governing bodies of sport in a lot of sports. And then, sadly, the sports councils said we're only going to grant aid one governing body in each sport. And they did that and specifically encouraged the male and female governing bodies to merge. And that perversely had a detrimental effect on women in leadership positions and coaching positions. Because what happened was, as women's sport got more acceptable and became more mainstream, and as these governing bodies merged, then men came in to coach women's sport, but the same didn't happen so much the other way around. So I'm not sure we've made a lot of progress in coaching. I remain to be convinced that that's the case, but no, I don't think we've made a lot of progress. I think the minute, or well, as I say, as female sport or as women's sport gets more accepted, say in football or whatever it is, gymnastics, you have male coaches stepping in because it's a more acceptable coaching position to be in. But the same doesn't happen the other way around in terms of female coaches coaching the male equivalent, say, for example, in gymnastics. So, yeah, I think we've got a long way to go in coaching as well, certainly.
Okay. So going now to the transgender issue regarding sports, because obviously it's a big hot topic. I've been trans women have competed in sport before, like from way back when. Renee Richards is a classic example of this as well. And as far as I'm aware, I think Renee didn't reach the elite of the sport, although she reached a high level. So, but my question is, there seems to have been a lot of trans athletes that have gone into women's sport. Where did this all begin? Because it seemed to be, say, a few to now seems to be much more than a trickle. So where did this begin, and what impact is this having, not just on this field of play, but outside it as well?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, Rennie Richards, she played on the women's tour, didn't she? But she was much older than the female athletes she was playing with. And she has come out much more recently and said she doesn't now think that was fair, because she said had she competed when she was the same age as the women tennis players she was competing against, she would have, won by miles. So it is interesting, the very high profile transsexual athletes. So Rennie Richards, and then if you look at who else have we got? We've got Mianna Bagger, for example, also competed on the women's golf circuit, but also now again thinks that it's unfair for male athletes to compete in female sports, and that includes trans women. So a lot of these very, very experienced transsexual trans women athletes don't now agree with what they perhaps argued for when they were younger. And, we've got Caitlyn Jenner, of course, who also says that, it would be ridiculous for a trans woman to play in female categories. So I think of all the very high profile trans women athletes we've got, you're going to struggle to find examples who will say it's fair for trans women to compete in female categories. Of the younger ones, I think that's maybe, different. So we've got some younger ones coming up now, younger trans women athletes who have perhaps been brought up in a different culture and think that, they've been brought up with the trans women and women environment. And so, that's perhaps a different question. But that's, I think that's how it's changed, that it used to be one or two athletes. And if you think about those athletes we've talked about, I mean, Caitlyn Jenner obviously didn't transition until after their sporting career. And we've got the same in cycling, where we've had, Robert Miller transitioned after a sporting career as competing in male categories. So I think although there were one or two, it's not the numbers that we've got now. And I think that the big difference for that is, well, firstly, the IOC rules have changed. They didn't have any rules in the first place. And then the 2004 rules said you had to have had sex reassignment surgery. So 2004, sex reassignment surgery, that will only affect a very small number of athletes, because only a small number of trans women have had sex reassignment surgery, for example. Whereas now, so IOC changed the rules in 2015 and said, no, you don't have to have had surgery. You can now just lower your testosterone from 10 nanomoles per litre, to below 10 nanomoles per litre. And the male range is, say, 10 to 30 nanomoles per litre. The female range is kind of 0 to 2 nanomoles per litre. So that was 2015. That then allows, a broader population, if you like, of people who identify as trans to compete in the female category. Those rules and regs wouldn't have filtered through for the 2016 Olympics, so they've only filtered through for 2020, which was 2021, in fact, in Tokyo. And then we had two trans women athletes there, Stephanie Barrett in archery and Laurel Hubbard in weightlifting. And we had two non-binary athletes, so Alana Smith in skateboarding and Quinn in football. But obviously those two non-binary athletes competed in female categories, and they wouldn't have qualified for the Olympics, let alone have won a gold medal in Quinn's case, if they'd been in male categories. So although they identify as non-binary, they were in female categories. So I think we've seen a big shift from, if you like, transsexual, the old-fashioned transsexual, which meant that you went through a full surgical transition, to now a transgender woman who might not have any surgery, might not have any testosterone suppression. And so this obviously gives governing bodies a bit of a problem in terms of what the rules are going to be. And the IOC changed the rules again in 2021 to now say it's up to governing bodies to decide what the appropriate rules and regs should be for their particular sport, but that there should be no presumption of advantage for trans women competing in female categories. And it has to be said that that is an extremely controversial regulation, because you'll struggle to find a scientist that will say that you can have no presumption of advantage between a trans woman who's made no medical transition and a female athlete. So that's very, very difficult. And now governing bodies, as I'm sure you know, are kind of struggling to work out how to construct their eligibility rules for the female category. It's only the female category that's the issue, of course, because trans men moving into the male category are not basically going to forfeit their competitive, their chance at being an elite competitor, because they will not win against males. So yeah.
So do you think part of the issue, regardless of which side of the debate a person may sit on, anyone may sit on, is part of the issue the indecisiveness of the governing bodies, not just the IOC, which obviously oversees the Olympics and is the biggest sports governing body in the world, but individual sports as well, because there seems to be no clarity one way or another. And if I was an athlete, to be just a trans athlete or someone never transitioned, I'd look at it and think, well, I don't know whether I'm coming or going here. Can I compete? Can I compete? I just think, is that unfair for everyone, regardless of which side of the debate you sit on?
Yeah, I absolutely totally agree with that. I think we've got to a situation where the vast majority of the public, so we've got the majority of the UK population do not agree with trans women competing in female sport. a huge majority of female athletes, whenever they're surveyed, don't agree with trans women competing in female sport. And yet governing bodies still permit that to happen. So then, individual trans women are open to people getting quite annoyed. And really what they need to, really the thing that is wrong is the rules, not the actual person. So it's always, in my view, move away from focusing on the individual and look at the rules. So you've got to look at the rules that the governing bodies come up with. And in the UK, we've had a very clear set of reports from the Sports Council Equality Group, which say quite clearly that the science shows us that you cannot have both inclusion of trans women in female categories and fairness for female athletes. You cannot have both in what are called sex-affected sports. So therefore, governing bodies have to decide how essentially they have to choose or they have to provide different ways for people to compete. So they could have additional categories for trans athletes, but saying that they'd have to have separate categories for trans men and trans women, because obviously trans men would be at a disadvantage as compared with trans women. Or they have an open category instead of a male category and a female category, or they have single sex categories, but trans women compete in the male category. Like trans men quite often stay in the female category because otherwise they don't have a competitive career. So the female category has always been welcoming for lesbian athletes and trans men. And the athletes that I've interviewed, the female elite athletes I've interviewed, are absolutely up for trans men, as long as they're not obviously supplementing with testosterone, to compete in female categories. And they say there's absolutely no issue with that. So the issue is always with trans women. So if trans women could feel happy competing in male categories, like trans men felt happy competing in female category, or not happy, but they accept that that's where their competitive career would lie, then we could, then we'd solve the problem. But, you can understand if somebody wants to identify as a woman, they don't want to compete in a category that says male. So you can have the open category that, can include everybody, trans men on testosterone, possibly, trans women, non-binary athletes, if they want to compete in that category. But you have a dedicated female category because of the huge male advantage that accrues primarily at puberty to male athletes, and that we can't mitigate with testosterone suppression. And all the science will show you that. So, yeah, that's where we've got to go. But the Sports Council Equality Group has set it out very, very clearly. And we've got also, of course, the Equality Act in the UK, which has a dedicated section on sport, section 195, which says it is legal to have single-sex sports, because otherwise, if it wasn't set out in the Equality Act, it might be deemed to be illegal, because it might be discriminating against men by not allowing them in the female category, and against women by not allowing them in the male category. So single-sex sport is legal in sex-affected sports, and it is legal to exclude trans women from female categories in sex-affected sports. The governing bodies are running scared of litigation, though. That's the issue. So I don't know if you followed British athletics or UK athletics. Okay, so a couple of weeks ago, UK athletics came out with a statement saying we want to provide single-sex categories. So we want basically to exclude trans women from female categories. We want to be able to provide single-sex categories. We think that's the fair way to go in athletics. But they said, but our lawyers have advised us that we can't do that, and that we might be open to being taken to court, to litigation. And then on the very same day, it was highly dramatic, Chris, on the very same day, the Equality and Human Rights Commission released a kind of parallel statement that said it is absolutely legal to provide single-sex categories. We don't know why UK athletics haven't disclosed that they've spoken to us about that, or we've spoken to them about that, and we have advised them that that is very likely to be legal. They can't say for definite it's legal unless it went to court. So I think that's why they've said very likely to be legal. So the EHRC, the Equality and Human Rights Commission, has clarified that single-sex sport and sex-affected sports is legal in the UK, but the governing bodies are still scared because they're scared of being sued.
Okay.
So.
All right. So again, to play devil's advocate, and this was something I was thinking about a few months ago. So you mentioned with certain sports, you need to have a woman's category and then a trans woman's category and then one for trans men. Okay, fine. I've only just play devil's advocate. I have sports which anyone could play regardless of gender. So one example I was thinking of was something like archery, for instance, where you're just aiming at a target, and there's probably other sports like that where it's not so much to do with force, or it's not that possible. One, because the science in those sports means that if you're male, you're still going to get if you're a trans woman or you're male, you're going to get an advantage over a woman. And also, does it go beyond just the scientific? Does it go beyond something like, for example, scholarships and things like this? Why, even in those sports, they may not be able to have separate categories?
Yeah, I mean, there are very few sports where men and women compete together, but equestrianism, for example, you don't have male and female categories. So everybody's in the same category. So as long as the sport is not sex affected, then there's no reason why men and women shouldn't play in the same category. Although you may still have, I don't know, because I don't really know about chess, but supposing you look at chess and you think, well, that's not a sex affected sport. You know, there's no physicality about the game of chess. But if it's an activity that has been primarily male, it may still be what's called in the Equality Act a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim to have female only chess. Do you see what I mean? Even though there's no physical reason in terms of physicality why men and women should be separate. So that would be one thing. And then when you think about something like archery, people have quite often said, well, maybe archery could be a sport that's not sex affected. But if you actually look at the distances, and if you look at the well, it's the points. Archery works on points as far as I understand it. Archery is not something I know a lot about, but it works on points. But the men at the elite level score a higher number of points than the women do. So there is a gap between male and female archery. And obviously, you could think that archery has a component of upper body strength in it. And upper body strength is one of the areas where there is a big gap between males and females in terms of muscle mass and lean body mass, and therefore power and strength. So I'm not convinced that archery would be a sport that's not sex affected, but obviously conceivably there are. And one thing that we can do is, I thought this was great, I don't know if you saw these at the Tokyo Olympics, the events where you had a mixed team, so you had 2 males, 2 females, doing, was it 400 meters?
Yeah.
So you had 4 laps or 400 meters, and you had a team of 2 males, 2 females. But again, you're still not getting away from sex there, are you? Because you're having a mixed team, but you've got to have equal numbers of the 2 sexes. So I think it's tricky in sport, because sport's probably one of the only areas of life where physicality in terms of, a cultural activity is incredibly important.
Yeah, I mean, as you were talking now, I did think of an area where you could have like open categories and possibly motorsport, because that's not, in one sense, because that's not just about the person, that's about the machine and how advanced that is as well. But I do obviously take your point. Obviously, biology plays a big part in that, which leads on to my next question, which is...
Can I just come back at you about motorsports? Because people have said about that as well. But people have said to me about the G-force when you're in a car, and about whiplash and the strain on the neck. So I think there's all those issues in sports that would have to be looked at, so we'd have to have the sports physiologists look at those in great detail. But anyway, yeah, going back.
Yeah. So again, you just said about physiology, and you talked about testosterone, which is an important factor. But do you think there's almost, it sounds a weird question, but do you think there's almost too much focus on testosterone in the sense of we don't necessarily look at the biomechanics of people and how that has a main effect on performance?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. And I think people misunderstand where testosterone does most of its work. So testosterone does most of its work at puberty. There is a testosterone surge in males in mini puberty and also in the womb. But most of the performance gap between males and females happens at puberty. And that is because of the effect of testosterone on the whole of the rest of the body. So as you say, the biomechanics. So men get, on average, taller with broader shoulders, longer limbs, bigger wingspan, and so on and so forth. And all of that happens at puberty. So governing bodies that say, oh, well, if you lower your testosterone to whatever, it used to be 10, now people have gone down to 5, and now increasingly they're going down to 2.5. You've shut the gate after the horse has bolted. Those athletes have gone through puberty. You are not going to undo puberty. So you're kind of taking a marker. It's a scientific fix, which doesn't work because testosterone has done all the work in creating bigger hearts, bigger lungs, a bigger frame, more lean body mass at puberty. Mm-hmm. So from that point of view, I think you're absolutely right. That's what androgens do for you at puberty if you're a male. Yeah, and that will affect the biomechanics, angles, levers, and so on, throwing action, yada yada.
Okay, so just quickly then, because I know we've not got long left. So going back to the admin, women in administrative roles in sport.
Yeah.
Well, have there been any studies as to why that, and even coaching actually, both of them, have there been any studies or any questionnaires given as to the reasons why women don't enough more women go into coaching and administration roles? Because obviously, as you say, it's not happening as often as what you say, but are there any specific reasons as to why that isn't the case?
There's an awful lot of research, to be honest, but you'd have to kind of, go through and pull it all together. And there's a whole range of reasons, as you could imagine, that come out from the research. So one of the reasons being that women don't have a lot of spare time as compared with men, and coaching is primarily a voluntary activity. So if women are doing a disproportionate amount of childcare and domestic work, and now they are going out to work outside of the home as well, then their voluntary time, their free time, is smaller than men's. So ergo, it's easier for men to, to do coaching for those reasons. So in a way, sport mirrors society, doesn't it? So in a way, if we're going to get more equality between men and women in sport, we need more equality between men and women in society. So we need shared, much more shared parenting, childcare, domestic work, and so on, caring work, unpaid caring work. So I think that's one of the reasons. I think one of the other reasons is, this kind of issue that people see men as natural leaders, maybe. So that's perhaps partly to do with men learning, being socialised throughout their lives to put themselves forward, that they take up space. So there've been studies, for example, looking at kids in playgrounds, and the boys take up much more physical space than the girls do. And then there's been studies looking at how much attention teachers give girls and boys, and teachers give boys more attention than girls. So we've kind of got to change all of that all the way through our society, haven't we, for it to impact sport. So I think sometimes it's interesting to look at sport and think, does sport lead the way in terms of how society changes, or does it follow kicking and screaming, and is one of the last areas of society to, become more equal between the sexes? And I think we kind of get a bit of both, so sometimes sport seems to lag far behind other areas of life in terms of equality between the sexes. But sometimes sport is an incredibly powerful kind of, the powerful optics of those lionesses, for example, on TV screens is, superb, isn't it?
Mhm.
So, so I think there's a lot of reasons. I think women have to be seen as leaders. They have to see themselves as leaders. Men have to take up the less space, which might be difficult for men to do if they, are used to talking more than women in any given situation. So there's lots and lots of socio-cultural reasons, I think, why it's hard for women to go through into the elite levels in coaching.
Okay. And finally, you've obviously looked into women and sport and sports policy for many years. In regards to women and sport, what would you want to see improve specifically? I know it might be a long list, but what you want to see improve?
I think I'm going to go back to what we touched on before, because that's what my recent research has been about. In the whole trans, how are we going to include trans people in sport debate, female athletes have been silenced. I mean, sometimes it's not that they've not been asked, sometimes they have been deliberately silenced. They've been told by sponsors and so on, you cannot talk about this topic. And that's why I did 2 of my big pieces of research, one with 19 female Olympians, asking them for their views of the IOC trans guidelines, and then just a very recent one with 25, 25 elite female Canadian athletes, including 8 Olympians, asking them for their views. And the degree of kind of distress, fear, anger, sadness from those women was shocking, really. I have to say it was shocking to behold, because they are supreme athletes. They understand that they can't do any more training than they're already doing, but their bodies are different from male bodies. They're not inferior, they're just different. They're built in different ways. And to be told that they cannot speak about this issue that primarily affects the female category has been really, as far as I'm concerned, an absolute disgrace. So I think what I'd like to see in sport is that female athletes in particular have a space to speak, and not just 1 or 2, representatives, but you can do surveys of all your athletes in particular governing body. So, World Rugby surveyed, 200 elite rugby players, female rugby players. And that way they can have a voice and they can input into sport policy. So I think athlete voice is something very close to my heart, and female athlete voice even more so.
Okay, all right. Right, well, thank you again for coming on the podcast. It's been an enlightening conversation, to say the least. Where can we find your work and what you do?
Where can you find my work? Follow me on Twitter, because my pinned thread has all my research attached to it. And it also has my website, a link to my website on there. And for academics, they can have a look for me on what's called ResearchGate, which is where all academics share their work and so on. But Twitter, I'm at Cathy Devine 56 on Twitter. Follow me on there, and access my work from there. Or even if you're not on Twitter or social media, just Google Cathy Devine female Olympians and you'll get that piece of research up, for example. So yeah.
Okay, we'll put your Twitter handle in the description below this video, all right? And once again, Cathy Devine, thank you so much for this interview. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks, Chris. It's been really, really lovely to chat. So lovely to meet you, lovely to chat.
All right, thank you very much. Take care.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.